He was in the shower when her text lit up his phone. Last night was everything. I didn't wake him to ask who she was. I already knew enough. Instead, I picked up his phone, typed 4 words back, and by the time he stepped out to dry off, I had already set a 3rd plate for dinner. I laid out the good china, the set we only used for holidays and anniversaries, and I filled a wine glass I had no intention of drinking from. By 7 that evening, our porch light was on, our dining room smelled like the roast I had started that morning, and a doorbell was about to ring on a night that would end with someone leaving this house changed forever. It was not going to be me. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. I want you to sit with a few questions before I tell you anything else, because the answers do not arrive the way you expect them to. What did I actually type back to her that morning, using his phone, in his voice, well enough that she never once suspected it wasn't him? Why would a woman invite the person threatening her marriage into her own home for dinner instead of confronting her husband the moment she found out? And why, only a few hours after that doorbell rang, was there a second phone sitting on my kitchen table that changed the entire shape of what I thought I was dealing with? Hold on to those questions. I promise you, by the time this story is finished, you will understand why I made every single choice I made that day, starting with the plate I set before he even knew I had read anything at all. My name is Nora Bennett, and for 22 years I built a life with a man named David, my high school sweetheart, the kind of couple people in our town used to point to as proof that young love could actually last if 2 people were willing to work at it. We married at 24, moved into a small starter home 2 streets over from where I grew up, and spent our first decade together building the kind of steady, unremarkable life I never once took for granted. I am not a woman who reacts loudly to problems. I never have been. I am a woman who manages things, who plans, who solves whatever is in front of me with quiet precision instead of noise, and that instinct, more than anything else, is what shaped every decision I made on the day this story truly begins. David built a career in sales over those same 22 years, working his way up from an entry-level territory rep to a director role that required frequent travel and long client dinners that stretched later and later into the evening as the years went on. I never questioned those late nights. Not really. Not for a long time. Sales is a demanding world, full of dinners and conferences and last-minute client emergencies that genuinely do happen, and I had no reason, for most of our marriage, to assume his absences were anything other than exactly what he said they were. Our daughter Grace grew up watching her father leave for airports more often than most of her friends' fathers did, and she grew up watching me hold the household together in his absence with a kind of calm efficiency I am only now starting to understand I learned from somewhere very specific. My own mother stayed in a marriage for 36 years that I privately considered, even as a young girl, a quiet kind of mistake. My father was not cruel, not in any dramatic sense anyone outside our home would have recognized, but he was absent in the ways that matter most, distracted, dismissive, always somewhere else even when he was sitting at our own dinner table. My mother endured it with a patience I admired and resented in equal measure, telling herself, and eventually telling me, that a strong woman simply finds a way to make peace with whatever she has been given. I remember, as a teenager, watching her smooth over one of his broken promises with the same practiced calm she used for everything else in our house, and feeling a quiet, private anger on her behalf that she herself never seemed to fully allow herself to feel. I loved my mother deeply. I also promised myself, very young, that I would never build my own life around that same kind of quiet endurance, and I did not fully understand how much that promise mattered until the morning everything with David finally came apart. Grace finished her second year of college that spring and came home for the summer, bringing with her a different kind of energy into a house that had settled, over the years, into a rhythm entirely built around David's schedule and my own carefully managed routines. Having her home again reminded me how much I had quietly rearranged my own life to accommodate his absences, how automatically I filled the empty evenings with committee meetings and my small catering business, rather than sitting with how often I was actually alone in that house. I did not think of myself as unhappy that spring. I thought of myself as busy, capable, someone who had built a good life out of the pieces available to her. Looking back now, I understand how much of that busyness had quietly become its own kind of distraction. Grace had always been perceptive in ways that occasionally caught me off guard, even as a child, and that first week home she mentioned, almost offhand, that her father seemed different lately, quieter at dinner, quicker to disappear into his phone the moment a meal ended. I remember brushing the comment aside gently, telling her that work had simply been demanding for him, the same explanation I had been offering myself for months, without ever fully examining whether it still held up under any real scrutiny. Children notice more than we give them credit for, and I have wondered since how much Grace had already begun sensing, long before I allowed myself to see it clearly, some shift in the atmosphere of our home that I was too close to recognize myself. I think often about a family trip we took when Grace was around 10 years old, a week at a rented cabin near a lake 3 hours from home, David teaching her to fish off the end of a small dock while I read on the porch, content in a way that felt entirely uncomplicated at the time. I remember David building a fire that week that took him nearly an hour to get right, laughing at his own stubbornness when I offered to help, insisting on doing it himself the way he insisted on doing most things himself. Grace still talks about that trip sometimes, unaware of how differently I now hold that memory, how much I have had to learn to let it remain a genuinely good memory, rather than letting everything that came later poison every good year that came before it. Our life together, viewed from the outside, would have looked, for most of those 22 years, exactly like what it appeared to be. We hosted holidays for both sides of our extended family. We attended Grace's school events together, sat beside each other at every recital and every graduation, presented a united front that was not, as far as I understood it at the time, any kind of performance at all. I want to be clear about this, because I think people sometimes assume a marriage that ends this way must have been quietly broken for years, waiting only to be exposed. Mine was not. Whatever eventually broke it grew somewhere separate from the parts of our life I lived inside every day, somewhere I simply never had reason to look until I finally did. David and I met at 17, in a chemistry class neither of us was particularly good at, paired together as lab partners by a teacher who had no idea she was setting the course of both our lives in motion. He was awkward in a way I found endearing back then, quick to make me laugh at exactly the moments I needed it during a difficult junior year, patient with me in a way none of the other boys in that school had bothered to be. He proposed on a bridge overlooking the small river that ran through our town, nervous enough that he dropped the ring box once before finally getting the words out, and I said yes, without a single moment of hesitation, certain, in the particular way only a 22-year-old can be certain, that I understood exactly what the rest of my life was going to look like. I remember my aunt pulling me aside at our wedding reception, a woman known in our family for saying exactly what she thought regardless of the occasion, telling me quietly that she had never fully trusted David's easy charm, that men who could talk their way into and out of anything sometimes learned to use that same skill in places it did not belong. I brushed her comment off that night as an old woman's unfounded suspicion, the kind of thing relatives say at weddings without any real evidence behind it, and I did not think about her words again for nearly 20 years. My aunt passed away 6 years before any of this came to light, and I have often wished, since finding out everything I eventually found out, that I could have one more conversation with her, if only to tell her she had seen something in him at 24 that took me nearly 2 decades longer to finally see clearly myself. The early years of our marriage were, by almost every measure, genuinely happy ones. We took a trip to the coast for our 5th anniversary that I still think about often, an entire week with no responsibilities beyond deciding where to eat dinner each night. David more relaxed and present than I had seen him in months before that trip. I remember one afternoon that week, walking along the shoreline together, David telling me he could not imagine building this life with anyone else, and me believing him completely, without a single reservation. I started my small catering business around that same time, initially just baking for neighborhood events, slowly building it into something that gave me an identity entirely separate from being David's wife or Grace's mother, something that was unmistakably my own. I want you to understand that I am not describing a marriage that was quietly miserable for decades, waiting only for a convenient moment to finally break apart. Whatever happened later grew out of something else, something that arrived gradually, in small enough doses that I never once saw the larger shape of it forming until it was already fully built. My catering business had grown, by that final summer, into something that occasionally required me to hire 2 or 3 part-time helpers for larger events, weddings mostly, the occasional corporate function for companies in town who had heard about me through word of mouth, rather than any advertising I had ever done. I remember feeling a particular kind of pride the week before everything changed, having just been asked to cater a 50th anniversary party for a couple whose own children had specifically requested me after tasting my food at another event months earlier. I mention this now because I think it matters that I was not, in that final stretch before discovering everything, a woman without her own sense of accomplishment or identity. Whatever David had been building quietly on the side, I had been building something entirely separate and genuinely mine at the very same time. The signs, when I look back now, were scattered further apart and more easily explained than people often assume. A co-worker of David's mentioned once, at a company holiday party, years before any of this, that David seemed like the kind of guy who could get away with anything, meant as an offhand compliment about his charisma rather than any real accusation, and I remember laughing along without giving it a second thought. There was a period, roughly 3 years before the shower incident, when his spending on his personal credit card increased in ways I noticed but never fully questioned, chalking it up to work-related expenses that would eventually be reimbursed, which they generally were, at least on paper. I remember mentioning it once, lightly, over dinner, asking whether his territory had expanded to require so much additional travel, and he answered easily enough, citing a new client region he had taken on, an explanation that satisfied me completely at the time, because I had no reason yet to look for anything beneath it. It is strange. Thinking back now, how thoroughly a confident, easy answer can close a question before it has even fully opened. How much of my own peace of mind during those years depended entirely on simply trusting that David's explanations were the whole truth, rather than a carefully maintained partial version of it. I also think, looking back, about how gradually my own instincts had been trained to accept smaller and smaller inconsistencies without questioning them, each accepted explanation making the next one slightly easier to accept as well, until inconsistency itself had quietly become part of the normal texture of our marriage, without my ever consciously deciding to allow it. There was a dinner party at a neighbor's house, roughly a year before everything came to light, where another woman at the table mentioned, almost in passing, that she had seen David's car parked outside a restaurant across town on an evening he had told me he was working late at the office. I remember feeling a small flicker of unease at the time, quickly smoothed over by David's easy explanation the next morning about an impromptu meeting with a client who preferred less formal settings. I did not think about that comment again for months, filing it away in the same drawer of my mind where I had already filed the receipt, the scarf, and the canceled anniversary, each one small enough on its own to dismiss, all of them together forming a shape I simply refused to look at directly until circumstances finally forced my hand. The cracks did not arrive all at once. A restaurant receipt from a place David never mentioned going to, tucked into a jacket pocket I found while doing laundry. A scarf in the back seat of his car that was clearly not mine, clearly too new to have been sitting there by accident. An anniversary dinner canceled at the last minute because of a supposed client emergency that, when I mentioned it casually to his assistant weeks later, she seemed to know nothing about. Each one of these moments, taken alone, felt small enough to explain away, and I explained every single one of them away, one at a time, the same way you might step over a single crack in a sidewalk without ever stopping to wonder whether the whole path beneath your feet has already begun to give way. I remember, too, a conversation with Teresa about a year before any of this came to light. A casual comment she made over coffee about how much she admired how independently I had built my catering business, despite David's demanding schedule, and how I had laughed it off at the time, telling her I had simply learned to fill the space his absences left behind. I did not realize, saying that out loud, how literally true it actually was, or how much of my own resilience during those years had quietly been shaped by a pattern of absence I had not yet understood the full cause of. There was one night, about 2 months before everything changed, when I found a second cologne in his overnight bag after a supposed conference, a scent I did not recognize and had never bought for him myself. I remember standing in our bedroom holding that bottle for a long moment, turning it over the way you turn over a question you are not yet ready to answer. I said nothing to him that night. I put it back exactly where I found it, zipped the bag closed, and went downstairs to finish making dinner, as though nothing in my understanding of my own marriage had shifted at all. I've thought about that night many times since, wondering what might have happened if I had asked him about it right then, instead of carrying that question quietly for 2 more months, until the morning his phone finally lit up on the bathroom counter and answered it for me. The morning it finally happened started like any other morning that summer. I had slept badly the night before, the kind of restless sleep that comes from carrying a question you have not let yourself fully ask, and I was already awake and moving through the kitchen when David got up for his shower. I heard the water start down the hall, that familiar sound I had heard every morning for over 20 years, and I was reaching for a mug in the cabinet above the counter when his phone buzzed against the granite behind me. I almost let it go. I want you to understand that. There was a version of that morning where I simply kept making coffee and let the phone sit there unread, the same way I had let every small sign sit unexamined for months before it. I did not let it go. I picked up the phone, more out of habit than suspicion, the way you glance at any screen that lights up near you, and the message on the lock screen stopped me completely. Last night was everything. No name attached, just a preview of a longer conversation beneath it, and a small photo beside the contact that was not anyone I recognized. I stood there in my kitchen, coffee mug still empty in my other hand, reading those 4 words over and over, waiting for some part of me to feel shocked. I did not feel shocked. I felt, more than anything, like a piece had finally clicked into a shape I had already half built in my mind over the last several months without letting myself see it clearly. I did not wake him. I want to be honest about why. It was not composure in the way people might assume, and it was not because I needed more time to process what I had just read. It was because some old, steady part of me had already started calculating what to do with the information before I had even finished absorbing it. I opened the thread further, scrolling back through weeks of messages while the shower continued running down the hall, learning her name, learning the nickname she used for me without ever having met me, learning enough about the shape of what had been happening that by the time the water shut off, I already understood I was not dealing with a single reckless night. I sat with the decision of what exactly to type back for longer than I expected to. I considered simply ignoring the message entirely and confronting him quietly that evening once I had gathered more on my own. I considered replying with something cold, something that would make clear I knew, ending whatever this was immediately, without ever needing to see her face at all. Neither option felt like it would give me what I actually needed, which was not simply confirmation that something was wrong, but a clear enough picture of exactly what I was dealing with to make a real decision about my own life, rather than reacting blindly to a single fragment of it. I remember, in those first few minutes standing in the kitchen, becoming aware of how quiet the house felt around me. Grace still asleep upstairs, David's shower still running steadily down the hall, the entire world outside our windows continuing on, as though nothing had changed at all, while inside me, everything had already shifted permanently. There is a particular loneliness in discovering something this large entirely on your own, with no one yet to share the weight of it, and I remember standing there wishing, briefly and uselessly, that I could call Teresa immediately, before remembering it was not yet 6 in the morning, and that whatever I decided to do next, I would have to decide it alone first. I typed a reply from his phone, in a voice I hoped sounded close enough to his own that she would not think twice. "Come over tonight. She's gone for the evening." I do not know, even now, exactly why those particular words came to me so quickly, except that some instinct told me the surest way to see the whole truth clearly was to bring it into my own home, on my own terms, rather than chase it through a phone screen or a confrontation he could still talk his way around. I set the phone back down exactly where it had been, picked up my coffee, and by the time David walked into the kitchen 10 minutes later, damp hair combed back, entirely unaware, I was already thinking through what needed to happen before 7 o'clock that evening. I told him, casually, over breakfast, that someone might be stopping by that evening, phrasing it vaguely enough that it was technically true, and specific enough that he would not think to question it. He barely looked up from his phone, distracted by something else entirely, and agreed easily, the way people agree to small domestic plans they assume are unremarkable. I remember watching him eat his breakfast that morning, entirely unaware that I had already read the exact words another woman had sent him 12 hours earlier, and feeling a strange, quiet calm settle over me. The kind of calm I imagine comes right before you do something you have never done before but somehow already know exactly how to do. I studied his face across the table that morning the way I imagine a stranger might study it, noticing details I had stopped consciously noticing years earlier. The particular way he stirred his coffee, the small crease between his eyebrows when he read something on his phone that irritated him, wondering how many mornings exactly like this one had already passed, with an entire hidden life sitting quietly behind his ordinary, familiar expressions. David left for the office a little after 8, kissing me goodbye the way he always did, entirely unaware that the kiss itself now carried a different weight than it had every other morning before it, and I spent that entire day moving through a version of my usual routine while quietly building something underneath it. I pulled up our shared calendar and found 3 entries over the past 2 months labeled only with initials, entries I had scrolled past a dozen times without ever asking what they meant. I checked a credit card alert on my phone for a hotel charge from 6 weeks earlier that I remembered him explaining away as a client dinner that ran late enough to require a room. By early afternoon, I had a folder open on my laptop, quietly gathering pieces of a picture I did not yet have the full shape of, working with the same methodical patience I use for planning any large dinner party. Except this time the guest list mattered in a way no dinner party ever had before. I stood in that kitchen for what felt like a long time, though it was probably closer to 2 minutes, scrolling back through the thread with a strange, focused calm I did not recognize in myself. I want to walk you through exactly what went through my mind in those first few minutes, because I think the honesty of it matters more than the drama of it. My first instinct, genuinely, was to wake him immediately, to hold the phone up and demand an explanation before I had time to think of anything else. I stood there with my thumb actually hovering over the bathroom door handle for a moment, close enough to push it open, before something steadier in me intervened. I thought about every other time over the past few months I had raised a small concern with David directly. The receipt, the scarf, the canceled anniversary, and how easily, every single time, he had produced an explanation calm enough to make me feel foolish for asking. I understood, standing in that hallway, that a direct confrontation now, armed with nothing but a single text message, would likely end the same way all those other conversations had ended, with me reassured, and him more careful, rather than with me actually knowing the truth. That realization is what shifted me from the woman who almost opened that bathroom door to the woman who quietly opened his messaging app instead, scrolling back through weeks of conversation with a focus that surprised me. I remember thinking, with a strange, detached clarity, that I finally understood why some people describe shock as feeling calm rather than feeling overwhelmed. I did not feel calm because I was unaffected. I felt calm because some deeper, older part of myself had apparently been quietly preparing for this exact moment for months, without ever telling the rest of me it was doing so. I learned her name from a saved contact, learned that she called me only ever the wife in lowercase, never Nora, as though I existed to her only as an obstacle rather than a person. I learned the rough outline of a relationship that had clearly been going on longer than a single reckless night, references to previous conversations, inside jokes I could not fully decode, a familiarity that told me this was not new. Somewhere underneath the numbness, a colder part of my mind was already assembling a plan, weighing what would happen if I confronted him immediately against what might happen if I did not, and settling, almost instinctively, on the second option before I had even fully articulated why. David's day at the office, I would later piece together from small comments he made without realizing their significance, unfolded entirely normally from his perspective. He ran a sales call that morning, grabbed lunch with 2 colleagues, complained lightly about a client who kept pushing back a contract renewal, entirely unaware that 3 miles away, in our kitchen, I was quietly assembling a folder that would eventually help end both his marriage and his career. I find something almost unbearable, even now, about how ordinary his day was, while mine was quietly transforming into something else entirely. How completely unaware a person can be, that the version of their life they believe they are still living has already, invisibly, ended. One of his colleagues mentioned to me, weeks later, after everything had already come apart, that David had seemed slightly distracted that particular afternoon during a client call, checking his phone more than usual, though nothing about his behavior struck anyone at the office as unusual enough to comment on at the time. It is strange to imagine now, a room full of people going about an entirely ordinary Tuesday, none of them aware that one of their colleagues was, at that very moment, unknowingly walking toward the end of both his marriage and, eventually, his career, all because of a message he had sent the night before to a woman who was not his wife. I spent part of that afternoon on the phone with our bank, using a routine question about a joint statement as cover, to quietly confirm dates and amounts on a hotel charge I had noticed months earlier and never fully investigated. The representative on the other end of the line had no idea she was helping me build a case against my own marriage, cheerfully confirming details in a bright customer service voice that felt strangely out of place given what those details actually meant. I remember thanking her politely, hanging up, and sitting in silence at my kitchen table for several minutes afterward, simply absorbing the fact that I now had documentation, however small, connecting a specific date to a specific charge that had nothing to do with any client dinner David had ever mentioned by name. I spent part of that afternoon at the grocery store, picking out a roast and the good vegetables, the kind of meal I reserve for holidays, moving through the aisles with a strange detachment, as though some other version of myself was handling the actual planning of the evening, while I quietly turned the larger situation over in my mind. The butcher, a man who had helped me choose cuts of meat for family dinners for over a decade, asked if we were celebrating something special, and I told him, without missing a beat, that we were simply having someone important over, a phrase that felt more honest than I expected it to, as soon as I said it out loud. I remember a neighbor stopping me near the produce section to ask what the occasion was, and I told her, without missing a beat, that we were just having someone over, and she smiled and wished me a good evening, entirely unaware of what that evening was actually going to become. There is something strange about moving through an ordinary day while carrying something this large inside you, smiling at neighbors, choosing vegetables, functioning completely normally, while the whole shape of your life is quietly shifting beneath the surface of it. I stopped at the florist on my way home from the grocery store that same afternoon, on impulse, buying a small arrangement for the center of the table, telling myself it was simply good hosting, though some part of me understood, even then, that I wanted the evening to look, on the surface, like nothing more than an ordinary pleasant dinner, an ordinary kindness extended to an unexpected guest, right up until the moment it very clearly was not. David came home for lunch briefly that same afternoon, a habit he kept up perhaps twice a month, and I remember serving him a sandwich at our kitchen counter with a steadiness that surprised even me, chatting about an upcoming weekend plan as though nothing whatsoever had shifted since breakfast. He mentioned, in passing, that he might need to stay late at the office that evening, an excuse I now understood was almost certainly meant to create space for exactly the reply I had already sent from his phone that morning, and I remember agreeing easily, telling him not to worry about dinner, that I would take care of it myself, a sentence that felt, in that moment, far more loaded than he had any idea it actually was. By 6 that evening, the table was set exactly the way I wanted it, 3 places instead of the usual 2, the good china laid out with more care than I typically give even our real holidays. I lit 2 candles, poured a glass of wine I had no intention of finishing, and put the roast in to rest while I waited for 7 o'clock, the hour I had suggested in my reply that morning. David came home around 6:30, showered again, dressed a little more carefully than an ordinary Tuesday evening required, though I do not think he consciously registered why he was doing it. I watched him move through our living room, checking his phone twice, oblivious to the fact that I already knew exactly who he was hoping might text him back before dinner. The doorbell rang at 7 exactly. I remember the sound of it more clearly than almost anything else from that entire year. A single ordinary chime that somehow felt louder than it had any right to be. In the few seconds between that chime and David reaching the door, I remember noticing small, useless details with unusual clarity. The way the candle flames bent slightly from the draft under the front door, the faint sound of Grace's music playing upstairs, the particular weight of the wine glass still full in my own hand. It is strange what the mind chooses to notice in the seconds before something irreversible happens, as though some part of you is trying to memorize the last ordinary moment before everything changes. David walked toward the door first, the way he always did when we were expecting company, and I stayed a few steps behind him in the hallway, watching his shoulders, watching the easy, unbothered posture of a man who still believed he understood exactly what kind of evening this was going to be. He opened the door with his usual pleasant greeting already halfway out of his mouth, and I watched, from just behind him, the exact moment his expression changed, confusion arriving first, then a slower, heavier kind of horror as he understood, all at once, precisely who was standing on our porch, and precisely what that meant about everything I already knew. There was a moment before dinner even began, while I was still in the kitchen finishing the last of the plating, when our neighbor from across the street, a woman named Susan who noticed everything on our block, mentioned in passing over the fence that she thought she recognized the car now parked in our driveway from a few weeks earlier, though she couldn't quite place when. I thanked her for the comment and filed it away carefully, another small piece confirming what the yellow towels would later confirm more directly, that whatever I was walking into that evening had already left traces around the edges of my own neighborhood that I simply had not been paying attention to until now. Her name was Lauren Shaw, and she stood on our porch that evening in a soft green dress, holding a bottle of wine she had clearly chosen with care, smiling the easy smile of a woman who believed she had been invited by the man she loved into a home she assumed she understood far better than she actually did. I noticed, in that first moment, How naturally she stepped onto our porch, no hesitation in her posture, the kind of ease that only comes from having stood in that exact spot more than once before. I stepped forward before David could recover enough to speak, greeted her warmly, told her how glad I was she could make it, and watched her confusion flicker for only a moment before she decided to trust the calm version of events I was offering her. David stood frozen in the doorway long enough that I had to gently guide the conversation forward myself, inviting her inside, complimenting the wine she had brought, walking her toward a table already set for exactly this moment. I want to explain something about the version of myself that hosted that dinner, because I think it matters for everything that follows. I did not raise my voice once that entire evening. I did not confront him in front of her. I played the role of a warm, welcoming host with a kind of precision that surprised even me, asking Lauren easy, friendly questions about her work, her apartment, how she and David had first met through what she believed was a work connection neither of us had ever mentioned to the other. Each question I asked had a second purpose beneath the first, gently drawing out details I already partly knew from the messages I had read that morning, watching her answer freely, entirely unaware she was walking through a conversation I had already mapped out in my mind hours earlier. David, by contrast, barely spoke through the first 20 minutes of that dinner, pushing food around his plate, glancing between the two of us with an expression somewhere between panic and disbelief, clearly trying to understand how much I actually knew and whether there was still some version of the evening where he could contain the damage. I let him sit in that uncertainty deliberately. I refilled Lauren's wine glass, asked her more about her family, complimented the bottle she had brought a second time, and watched him grow more unsettled with every ordinary pleasant minute that passed, understanding slowly that whatever performance I was putting on, it was not for her benefit at all. I remember refilling the water glasses at one point, purely to give my hands something to do, moving around that table with the same practiced calm I use hosting any dinner party, aware the entire time of how strange it was that my body knew exactly how to perform hospitality, even while my mind was cataloging evidence against the very people I was hosting. Lauren complimented the roast twice, unaware that the woman serving it to her had spent the entire day quietly building a case against her own husband before she had even arrived. There is a particular kind of discipline required to smile warmly at someone, while simultaneously understanding, with growing certainty, that everything about the situation in front of you is built on a foundation of lies, and I did not know, until that evening, that I possessed that discipline at all. At one point, Lauren asked David a small, affectionate question about a weekend trip they had apparently taken together earlier that summer, referencing it casually, the way you reference a shared memory with someone you trust completely. David's face went pale in a way I do not think Lauren noticed, too focused on her own story to catch the flicker of panic crossing his features, but I caught it fully, filing away the approximate dates she mentioned, understanding that whatever alibi he had given me for that particular weekend was about to be worth revisiting closely once this dinner was over. There was a moment partway through dinner that told me this had gone further than even I initially suspected. Lauren mentioned, almost in passing, how much she loved the yellow guest towels in our downstairs bathroom, the kind of detail a person only knows if they have actually used that bathroom before, more than once. I kept my expression perfectly pleasant as I thanked her, filing that detail away carefully, understanding in that instant that whatever version of this story I thought I was walking into, The real one had clearly been unfolding in my own home for longer than a single night, longer than the single text I had read that morning suggested at all. Grace came home in the middle of that dinner, earlier than any of us expected, having left her summer job a little early that evening. I heard her key in the front door, heard her call out a casual greeting, and watched her stop in the doorway of our dining room, taking in the scene in front of her. 3 places set, a stranger sitting where she usually sat, her father visibly pale and silent. She did not say anything right away. She looked at me instead, searching my face for some explanation, and I gave her the smallest, steadiest look I could manage. A look I hoped told her everything was under control, even though I was still, in that moment, working out exactly how much control I actually had. I introduced Grace simply, without elaboration, and watched Lauren's easy composure falter for the first time that evening, some instinct clearly telling her that the presence of a college-age daughter changed the shape of the room in a way she had not anticipated. Grace excused herself upstairs after only a few minutes, and I could feel, even without seeing her, that she was listening from somewhere just out of sight, piecing together on her own what none of us had said out loud yet. I checked on her briefly once the dinner had ended, sitting on the edge of her bed for a few minutes, telling her only that everything would be explained soon and that she should not worry more than she already clearly was. It is a strange kind of parenting, protecting your child from a truth she is already close enough to sense clearly, while still trying to hold the rest of an unraveling evening together with steady hands. Dinner ended not long after that, Lauren leaving in tears within the hour, though not for the reason she originally believed she might. I never confronted her directly about the affair itself that night. I did not need to. Something in the atmosphere of that table, in the questions I had asked, in the daughter who had suddenly appeared and disappeared upstairs, made the truth of the situation clear enough to her without me ever having to say it plainly. She left apologizing, though I am still not entirely certain, even now, whether she was apologizing to me, to herself, or simply to the version of the evening she had walked into expecting something else entirely. David and I did not speak at all once the door closed behind her. I cleared the table alone, rinsing dishes I had spent all afternoon preparing, while he sat at the table behind me, silent, clearly waiting for some kind of explosion that never came. I remember feeling, that night, less like a woman who had just confirmed her husband's affair, and more like someone standing at the very beginning of something much larger than a single dinner, though I could not yet have told you exactly what that larger thing was going to become. I finished the dishes slowly, deliberately, giving myself time to think before either of us said anything at all, and when I finally sat down across from him, I told him only that we would talk in the morning, that I needed the night to think clearly, a sentence that seemed to unsettle him far more than any immediate confrontation would have. I want to be honest about the days immediately following that dinner, because they were harder than the dinner itself in some ways. I found myself, more than once, wondering whether I had overreacted, whether a single text and a comment about towels was really enough to justify the elaborate evening I had staged. There was one particular afternoon, 3 days after the dinner, when I nearly convinced myself to simply move forward, as though nothing had happened, to accept whatever explanation David might eventually offer, and quietly rebuild something resembling normalcy. I remember standing at the kitchen sink that afternoon, staring out at our backyard, feeling exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with sleep, and wondering whether the version of myself capable of hosting that dinner so calmly had used up some reserve of strength I was not sure I still had for whatever came next. David, in the days after Lauren left in tears, alternated between stretches of guilty silence and sudden, almost desperate attempts at normalcy, bringing home flowers one evening, suggesting we go to dinner together the next, as though enough small gestures might quietly erase what had happened before either of us needed to discuss it directly. I let him believe, for a few days, that I was still deciding what to do, partly because I genuinely was, and partly because I understood, instinctively, that his uncertainty about how much I actually knew was the only leverage I currently had. Teresa talked me through those first uncertain days more than once, reminding me over the phone that the discomfort I felt was not evidence that I was wrong to look further, only evidence that I was a person who took marriage seriously enough not to end one over a single incomplete impression. She reminded me, gently but firmly, that the yellow towels alone were a strange enough detail that it was worth understanding fully before deciding anything, one way or the other, about what our marriage still was or was not. I called my closest friend Teresa the following morning, before David had even left for the office, sitting alone in my car in the driveway so he would not overhear. Teresa had known me for over 20 years, long enough to hear the specific flatness in my voice that told her this was not an ordinary complaint about marriage. I told her everything: the text, the reply I had sent from his phone, the dinner, the yellow towels, and she listened without interrupting until I finally ran out of words. She told me something that morning I have held on to since. She said some women spend years building a case against a marriage without ever admitting to themselves that is what they are doing, and that whatever I did next, I deserved to walk into it with my eyes fully open, rather than half closed, the way I had been for months already. Together over the following days, Teresa and I began quietly gathering everything we could find, treating the situation with the same careful precision I had used setting that third plate. Except now the documents were bank statements instead of dinnerware, calendar entries instead of seating charts. Teresa suggested, on our second day of searching, that hotel chains typically keep loyalty program records tied to a member's account, regardless of who actually pays for the room, and she was right. I called the customer service line for the chain David always mentioned staying with for work, posing as someone helping her husband consolidate his rewards points, and the representative on the line, entirely unaware of what she was actually confirming, read off a list of stay dates going back over a year that lined up almost perfectly with the calendar entries I had already flagged. We found a pattern of hotel charges stretching back further than either of us expected, evenly spaced, deliberate, nothing like the occasional reckless mistake David's excuses had always implied. I want you to understand that this part of the story did not move quickly. It took days of careful, quiet work, sitting at my kitchen table long after David had left for the office, slowly building a picture whose true size I would not fully understand, until I found something else entirely, hidden in the one place I never thought to look until almost by accident. There were entire afternoons that produced nothing new at all, hours spent cross-referencing dates that led nowhere, credit card statements that turned out to have perfectly ordinary explanations once I actually investigated them instead of assuming the worst. I mention this because I think true investigations, even small domestic ones like mine, rarely move in a straight line toward the truth. They move in fits and starts, forward and sideways and occasionally backward, and I spent far more hours that week confirming dead ends than I spent uncovering anything meaningful. Before Peter's name ever came up, there was an earlier false lead that Teresa and I chased for the better part of a day. A younger woman on David's own sales team, whose name appeared several times in his calendar, under vague meeting titles that seemed, at first glance, more personal than professional. We spent an entire afternoon convinced we had found the answer, cross-referencing her name against social media, against any public information we could find, building an entire theory before Teresa finally suggested we simply check whether those calendar entries corresponded to an actual project both of them were assigned to. I remember the specific relief and embarrassment I felt when that theory collapsed. Relief that an innocent young employee was not actually entangled in any of this. An embarrassment at how quickly I had been willing to build an entire narrative around someone based on nothing more than a handful of ambiguous calendar entries. They did. It was, disappointingly and reassuringly at the same time, an entirely legitimate work relationship, and I remember feeling a strange mixture of relief and frustration at having spent so much energy chasing something that turned out to mean nothing at all, a reminder that not every unusual detail in a life like David's necessarily pointed toward betrayal, even during a period when so many of them, it would turn out, actually did. For a few days that week, Teresa and I became convinced the pattern we were seeing pointed towards someone else entirely. A colleague of David's named Peter, who had covered for him more than once over the years on trips I now suspected were not entirely business-related. Peter had traveled with David on several of the trips tied to the hotel charges we found, and for a brief, uncomfortable stretch, I genuinely believed Peter might have known everything all along, quietly protecting his friend at my expense. Teresa, ever practical, suggested I reach out to Peter's wife under the guise of an unrelated conversation, and what I learned from that call surprised me more than almost anything else that week. Peter's wife had no idea any of this was happening either, and when I mentioned the trips carefully, without accusation, she confirmed dates that did not line up with anything David had told me. Dates where Peter himself had been home the entire time, unaware his name had ever been used to cover for anyone. I remember the specific afternoon I called Peter's wife, sitting in my car outside a coffee shop rather than at home, worried David might somehow overhear even a one-sided conversation. I introduced the topic carefully, mentioning an upcoming trip I claimed David had told me about, watching for any confirmation or hesitation in her voice that might tell me whether she already knew more than I did. She answered easily and specifically, mentioning her own memory of exactly which weekends Peter had actually been traveling for work that year. Weekends that, when I checked them later that day against the hotel charges Teresa and I had gathered, did not overlap at all with the dates in question. Whatever cover story David had constructed, it had not required Peter's actual participation at any point, only the casual use of his name as a plausible-sounding excuse. That discovery unsettled me more than I expected it to, because it meant David had not simply been careless or unlucky in getting caught. He had been deliberate, borrowing a friend's unknowing reputation to create cover that had nothing to do with the friend at all. I sat with that realization for an entire evening, turning over exactly how much planning must have gone into maintaining something like this for as long as it apparently had been going on, and understanding, with a kind of cold clarity, that whatever I was uncovering was not a single mistake made in a moment of weakness. It was a structure, built carefully, over time, by someone I had shared a bed with for over 2 decades. Teresa connected me that same week with an old college friend of hers, an accountant named Renee, who occasionally helped people quietly untangle exactly this kind of financial pattern without involving anyone else until the full picture was clear. I met with Renee at her small office on a Thursday afternoon, bringing every statement, every calendar entry, every scrap of documentation Teresa and I had gathered so far. Renee worked through it methodically over several hours, cross-referencing dates against David's actual travel schedule, against expense reports I had quietly requested access to through an old friend in his company's finance department, against patterns that, laid out together, told a story far more organized than anything I had imagined on my own. I remember watching her work in near silence for long stretches, occasionally muttering a date under her breath, circling something on a printed page, building a case with the same quiet, unglamorous patience I imagine she brought to every client who ever sat across from her, carrying a similar kind of folder. She showed me, on a printed spreadsheet she had built as we talked, 3 distinct clusters of activity, spaced almost exactly 6 weeks apart across the past 2 years. A rhythm too consistent to be coincidental, the kind of pattern she said she had seen before, in cases involving more than one ongoing relationship, rather than a single affair that simply continued over time. At one point, Renee asked whether I wanted her to keep looking or stop where we already were, gently warning me that whatever we found next might be harder to sit with than what we already had. I remember telling her, without much hesitation, that I would rather know everything now than discover pieces of it slowly over months or years, the way I had already been discovering pieces of it without realizing what they added up to. She nodded, unsurprised, and told me that was the answer most of her clients eventually gave her, usually after trying, at least once, to convince themselves they preferred not knowing. I remember sitting in my car in Renee's parking lot for nearly 20 minutes after that meeting ended, unable to make myself start the drive home right away. There is a particular kind of grief that arrives not from a single sharp revelation, but from watching a slow, methodical confirmation of something you had already begun to suspect, each new detail landing with less shock but somehow more weight than the one before it. I thought about all the small moments over the past 2 years I now understood differently. A birthday dinner David had seemed distracted during, an anniversary trip he had cut short by 1 day for a supposed work emergency. Ordinary memories that now carried an entirely different meaning once I understood what else had likely been happening in the background of that same stretch of time. Renee explained that the spacing and structure of the charges suggested this had likely been going on for close to 2 years, not the few months I had originally assumed, based on the tone of the text I had read that morning. She told me something that stayed with me long after I left her office. She said patterns this consistent rarely belong to a single relationship. They usually suggest someone managing more than one thing at once, someone comfortable enough with the deception that it no longer required the same nervous energy a newer affair typically shows in its financial trail. She showed me, on that same spreadsheet, a smaller secondary cluster of charges she had initially assumed were simply Lauren-related, but which, on closer inspection, did not quite match the same rhythm, a detail she flagged for me without yet being able to explain, one that would only make sense once I found the second phone days later. I remember driving home that afternoon, turning her words over carefully, unable to shake the feeling that Lauren, however painful her presence at my table had been, might not be the whole story after all. Grace, without my asking her to, mentioned one evening that she had noticed her father acting strangely protective of the garage over the past few months, twice asking her not to park her own car in there, when she visited home for weekends earlier that year. A request that had struck her as odd at the time, but not odd enough to mention until now. I thanked her for telling me, careful not to explain exactly why the detail mattered so much, and made a mental note to search that space more thoroughly than I had the first time I had looked through it for nothing in particular. I began searching our house more deliberately after that conversation, no longer waiting for accidental discoveries the way the cologne and the receipt had been found. I went through David's home office one afternoon while he was at work, methodical in a way that surprised even me, checking drawers I had never had reason to open before, folders I had always assumed were simply old tax documents. I found nothing unusual there, which only made me more determined rather than less. I moved to the garage that same afternoon, searching through boxes of old sporting equipment neither of us had touched in years, working methodically from one corner to the other, rather than searching randomly the way I might have a few weeks earlier. I checked an old fishing tackle box first, finding nothing but rusted lures and fishing line. I checked a box of winter camping gear next, finding nothing there either, and had nearly convinced myself Grace's comment about the garage had been nothing more than an odd coincidence, unrelated to anything I was actually looking for. It was only when I reached the very back corner, behind a stack of winter tires we had not used in years, that I noticed the golf bag sitting slightly apart from everything else, angled in a way that suggested someone had moved it recently, rather than left it untouched for as long as the dust on everything around it suggested. And it was there that I found a second phone, small, inexpensive, clearly purchased specifically to be forgotten by anyone who was not looking for it. I sat on the cold garage floor for a long time before I even turned it on, holding that phone in both hands, understanding that whatever was on it was going to change the shape of this story again, in a way I was not yet prepared for. My hands were shaking slightly, I remember, not from fear exactly, but from the particular kind of anticipation that comes right before you learn something you cannot ever unlearn afterward. I thought, briefly, about simply putting the phone back exactly where I found it, pretending I had never seen it, allowing myself one more evening of the version of my life I had believed in that morning. I did not do that. Some part of me understood, sitting there in the cold and the dim light filtering through the garage window, that I had already crossed too far past the point where turning back was still an option available to me. The screen lit up without a passcode, an oversight that told me David had never truly believed anyone would think to look this carefully. What I found inside that phone was not a continuation of what I already knew about Lauren. It was an entirely separate conversation, with an entirely separate woman, stretching back even further than the pattern Renee had identified. Careful, consistent, and completely unknown to Lauren herself. Exactly as it had been unknown to me until that exact moment sitting alone on the garage floor with the cold concrete beneath me and an entire second life in my hands. Her name, according to the messages on that second phone, was Kimberly, and the conversation between them stretched back nearly 3 years, longer than anything Renee had suggested. Longer than my entire relationship with the idea that something was wrong. I sat on that garage floor for nearly an hour reading, unable to make myself stop even as each new message made the picture harder to look at directly. There were photographs of a small apartment I did not recognize, casual and domestic in a way that suggested David spent enough time there to feel comfortable. Messages about ordinary things, grocery lists, a shared joke about a television show, the kind of mundane intimacy that somehow felt more devastating to read than anything more dramatic might have. Kimberly lived 2 towns over, worked at a marketing firm David had done business with early in his current role, and referred to him, throughout hundreds of messages, with a familiarity that made it clear this was not a new development layered on top of whatever was happening with Lauren. Scrolling further back, I found photographs from a weekend trip I recognized instantly. The same weekend Lauren had mentioned so casually at dinner, except the dates did not match at all. I learned, scrolling further, that Kimberly was younger than I expected, closer to Grace's age than mine, a detail that struck me harder than almost anything else I found that day. There were messages where she asked David directly, more than once over the years, whether he had any plans to eventually leave his marriage, and messages where he answered vaguely each time, promising a future he clearly had no intention of actually building with her. The exact same kind of vague promise, I would later realize, he had likely been offering Lauren during roughly the same stretch of years. Reading those parallel promises to two different women, each of them apparently believing they were the only one waiting on his eventual decision, was harder to sit with than almost anything else in this entire story. David had told Kimberly he was attending a conference the same week he told me he was traveling with a colleague, and told Lauren an entirely different story altogether, 3 separate versions of the same missing days, each one carefully tailored to whichever woman was asking. It ran alongside it, separate, careful, maintained with its own rhythm of check-ins and excuses that never once overlapped with the pattern Lauren's relationship had created. I sat on that garage floor scrolling through years of a life I had no idea existed, feeling something shift inside me that was not quite shock and not quite grief, something closer to a strange, cold clarity about exactly what kind of person I had actually been married to. I remember checking the time at one point, realizing I had been sitting on that concrete floor for well over an hour, my legs stiff beneath me, entirely unaware of how much time had actually passed while I worked through message after message, each one adding another small piece to a picture that was already far larger than anything I had imagined, even after everything Renee had shown me days earlier. I called Teresa from the garage before I even went back inside the house, sitting on the cold concrete with the second phone still in my hand, unable to fully process what I had just found without saying it out loud to someone first. She was quiet for a long moment after I finished explaining, and then she said something I have carried with me since, that some betrayals are simple enough to understand in a single conversation, while others take time to fully absorb because the scale of the deception itself requires a kind of recalibration most people are not prepared to do quickly. She told me to come stay with her that night if I needed to, an offer I did not take, though the simple fact that it was offered helped more than I expected it to. I did not confront him that night. I want you to understand why, because I think it matters. I had already learned, from the dinner with Lauren, that confronting David with partial information only ever produced partial honesty. I spent the following 2 days quietly building a complete picture instead, cross-referencing Kimberly's messages against the same calendar entries and hotel charges Renee had already helped me organize, understanding for the first time exactly how 2 entirely separate relationships had been running in parallel for years without either woman ever discovering the other, and without me discovering either of them, until circumstances I had partly engineered myself finally forced the first thread into the open. I confronted David a second time, and this confrontation looked nothing like the first. I do not think I fully understood, walking into that kitchen that evening, how differently my own body would feel carrying complete certainty instead of partial suspicion. My hands did not shake the way they had the first time. My voice did not waver. I simply sat down, opened the folder, and began, methodically, the way Renee had taught me without ever meaning to teach me anything at all. When I finally sat David down, I did it deliberately, at our kitchen table, the same table where I had hosted that dinner weeks earlier, though this time, there was no third-place setting and no performance of hospitality softening the moment. I laid out the documentation methodically, starting with Lauren, then moving into the hotel patterns Renee had identified, and finally placing the second phone itself on the table between us. I watched every trace of composure leave his face at once, watched him reach for excuses that died halfway out of his mouth as he understood, piece by piece, exactly how much I already knew before he had said a single word in his own defense. He asked me, at one point, how long I had known, his voice smaller than I had ever heard it in 22 years of marriage. I told him the truth, that I had known about Lauren since the morning her text first lit up his phone, and had only discovered Kimberly within the past week, though I suspected, based on everything Renee had shown me, that his own memory of exactly when each relationship began was probably more precise than mine. He did not correct me. He sat in silence for a long moment. The kind of silence I understood, even then, was not confusion, but the particular stillness of a person finally realizing there is no version of an explanation left that could possibly make any of this smaller than it actually was. He tried, briefly, to frame it as two isolated mistakes, two separate lapses in judgment that had nothing to do with each other, as though separating them into unrelated incidents might somehow make either one smaller. I asked him plainly how two entirely different women, in two entirely different towns, had each believed for years that they were the only meaningful relationship outside our marriage, and he did not have an answer for that question that held together for more than a few seconds. I asked him, directly, whether he had ever once considered simply telling me the truth, at any point over 3 years, rather than continuing to build an increasingly elaborate structure to avoid a single honest conversation. He said he had thought about it more times than I would believe, that he had rehearsed the words in his head on long drives home, and that every time, he had convinced himself the timing was wrong, that I seemed happy, that our life together seemed too settled to risk disrupting over something he told himself he could eventually end on his own. I asked him how long he had been telling himself that same story, and he admitted, quietly, that it had been close to 2 years since he first believed he was going to stop, and had not stopped. I asked him, directly, whether he had ever once considered simply telling me the truth, at any point over 3 years, rather than continuing to build an increasingly elaborate structure to avoid a single honest conversation. He said he had thought about it more times than I would believe, that he had rehearsed the words in his head on long drives home, and that every time, he had convinced himself the timing was wrong, that I seemed happy, that our life together seemed too settled to risk disrupting over something he told himself he could eventually end on his own. I asked him how long he had been telling himself that same story, and he admitted, quietly, that it had been close to 2 years since he first believed he was going to stop, and had not stopped. I asked him one final question that evening, one I had been turning over since I first found the second phone. I asked him whether he had ever once, in 3 years, considered what it would cost Grace to eventually learn the truth about her father, not just about me. He did not answer that question at all, and his silence told me more clearly than any words could have that he had genuinely never let himself think that far beyond his own immediate comfort. that the structure he had built to protect himself from consequences had never once accounted for the people who would eventually be forced to live inside the wreckage of it alongside him. He shifted eventually into blaming the stress of his job, the loneliness of constant travel, a vague unhappiness he claimed he had never known how to voice to me directly, and I remember sitting across from him, thinking that every excuse he offered was really just another version of the same thing. He had never once considered that honesty, however difficult, was actually available to him as an option. I understood, sitting there, that the dinner I had hosted weeks earlier had never really been about exposing Lauren specifically. It had been the first deliberate step in something larger I had not yet had a name for at the time. A decision to finally see the full shape of my own life clearly, no matter how much it cost me to look directly at it. There is a particular kind of clarity that arrives only after the last piece of a picture finally locks into place, and sitting across from David that evening, I felt that clarity settle over me completely, quiet and absolute, the opposite of the confusion I had been carrying for months without fully admitting it to myself. I understood, sitting there, that the dinner I had hosted weeks earlier had never really been about exposing Lauren specifically. It had been the first deliberate step in something larger I had not yet had a name for at the time. A decision to finally see the full shape of my own life clearly, no matter how much it cost me to look directly at it. There is a particular kind of clarity that arrives only after the last piece of a picture finally locks into place, and sitting across from David that evening, I felt that clarity settle over me completely, quiet and absolute, the opposite of the confusion I had been carrying for months without fully admitting it to myself. David asked me, before I finally stood up from that table, what I was going to do next. And I remember telling him honestly that I did not yet know the specific shape of it, only that I knew, with complete certainty, that whatever came next would not involve pretending any of this had not happened. He asked whether there was any version of events where we might still find a way through this together, and I told him that question itself revealed how little he still understood about what had actually broken. It was never only about Lauren, or only about Kimberly. It was about 2 decades of small, careful omissions that had trained me, slowly and without my full awareness, to accept a version of honesty that was never actually complete. There was a night, somewhere between that confrontation and my conversation with Lauren, when I sat alone on our back porch, long after Grace and David had both gone to bed in separate parts of the house, turning over the entire shape of the last several years in my mind. I did not cry that night, though I expected to. Mostly, I felt a strange, quiet exhaustion, the particular tiredness that comes after finally putting down something heavy you had convinced yourself for years you were still capable of carrying. I remember looking up at a sky full of stars that felt almost indifferent to the size of what I was sitting with, and finding, unexpectedly, a small measure of comfort in that indifference, in the reminder that the world continued on a scale far larger than any single betrayal, however large it felt from inside my own kitchen. There was one more turn still ahead of me that I did not expect. A week after that conversation, I reached out to Lauren directly, not out of any impulse toward cruelty, but because I wanted to understand exactly how much of this she had genuinely never known. We met at a coffee shop neither of us had any connection to, an oddly civil conversation between 2 women who had every reason to resent each other and somehow did not. She arrived nervous, clearly unsure what to expect, and I remember deliberately keeping my voice gentle, telling her plainly that I was not there to punish her, only to understand. Lauren admitted, with what appeared to be genuine shock, that she had believed for the entire 2 years of her own relationship with David that she was the only one, that whatever guilt she carried about being involved with a married man had at least been carried alone. She told me details about their relationship I had not known, weekend trips she believed were entirely private, conversations where David had described our marriage as effectively over, long before it actually was. A version of events that made her own choices feel, to her, far more justifiable than they had felt sitting across from me at that dinner table weeks earlier. I asked her, near the end of our conversation, whether she regretted any of it, and she was quiet for a long moment before answering that she regretted trusting him more than she regretted anything about the choices she herself had made. I remember finding an unexpected kind of understanding in that answer, recognizing in her something of my own experience, a woman who had also built a version of her life around explanations she had no real way of verifying at the time. We did not become friends after that conversation, but we parted on far better terms than either of us likely expected walking in, and she promised, before we said goodbye, to share anything else she remembered that might help me going forward. Learning about Kimberly clearly wounded her in a way I had not fully anticipated, her composure cracking for the first time since I had met her, and in an unexpected turn neither of us saw coming. She ended up sharing details about David's patterns and habits that strengthened the case I was quietly building, far more than anything Renee or Teresa had uncovered on their own. I met with a divorce attorney named Marcus the following week, carrying a folder thicker than anything I imagined I would ever need to compile about my own marriage. I met with a divorce attorney named Marcus the following week, carrying a folder thicker than anything I imagined I would ever need to compile about my own marriage. I remember sitting in his waiting room beforehand, flipping through an old magazine without reading a single word of it, rehearsing in my head how I would even begin explaining everything I had gathered over the past several weeks. When I finally sat down across from him and opened that folder, laying out document after document in the same methodical order I had used building it, I watched his expression shift slightly, a small, professional recognition that this was not a typical first consultation. Marcus reviewed everything methodically, the hotel statements, the calendar entries, Renee's timeline, the messages from both phones, and told me something that shifted how I understood the months ahead. He said the documentation Teresa and Renee had helped me build was unusually thorough, the kind of case that gave me significant leverage in a settlement, particularly given how closely tied David's sales territory was to certain joint business assets we had built together over the years, without either of us fully realizing how entangled they had become. I remember asking Marcus, during that first meeting, whether he had seen cases like mine before. 2 separate long-term relationships running in parallel for years without either woman discovering the other. He told me, carefully, that he had seen infidelity many times, but rarely documentation this organized, and that most of his clients came to him with suspicion rather than proof, forcing a much slower and more contentious discovery process than the one we were about to begin. I remember feeling, in that moment, a strange kind of vindication in having done the difficult work of gathering everything myself before ever walking into his office, understanding that the months of quiet investigation had given me a kind of control over the process that many people in my position never get to have. Marcus explained that the divorce discovery process itself, the formal exchange of financial records both sides are required to produce, was likely to expose far more than David anticipated, especially once his company's own compliance department noticed the same irregular travel and expense patterns Renee had already identified independently. Marcus explained that the divorce discovery process itself, the formal exchange of financial records both sides are required to produce, was likely to expose far more than David anticipated, especially once his company's own compliance department noticed the same irregular travel and expense patterns Renee had already identified independently. He walked me through the specific mechanics of how joint business assets tied to David's sales territory, including a small ownership stake in a regional distribution partnership we had invested in together years earlier, would likely need to be divided or bought out entirely, numbers large enough that Marcus recommended bringing in a forensic valuation specialist before any settlement conversations formally began. I remember Marcus telling me, almost as an aside, that infidelity itself rarely changes a settlement significantly in our state, but financial misconduct tied to company resources absolutely can, and the two, in David's case, were far more intertwined than he had ever imagined anyone would take the time to untangle. He also cautioned me, gently, that a thorough case like mine sometimes takes longer to resolve precisely because there is more at stake to negotiate over, and he was right. What I had assumed might resolve within a few months of filing stretched out considerably longer, each additional month bringing new documentation, new disclosures, new small confirmations of exactly how much David had been managing simultaneously across every part of his life. The settlement negotiations themselves stretched across nearly 4 months, longer than Marcus had originally predicted, largely because of disputes over the distribution partnership stake and a disagreement about how much of David's reduced future income, following his eventual termination, should factor into ongoing support calculations. I remember sitting through 2 lengthy mediation sessions during that stretch, sessions where Marcus methodically walked through every document Renee had helped assemble months earlier, each one a small, quiet vindication of the hours I had spent at my kitchen table, piecing together a picture David had assumed would remain hidden indefinitely. Within 2 months of the discovery process beginning, David's company quietly opened its own internal review after his expense reports came under scrutiny during a routine audit, triggered, in part, by the same documentation now moving through our divorce proceedings. I remember learning about the audit itself almost by accident, through a passing comment from Marcus during one of our regular case updates, and feeling a strange, quiet sense that events I had set in motion weeks earlier were now unfolding in places entirely beyond my own direct involvement, gathering a momentum of their own. I did not orchestrate that outcome directly, though I will admit I felt no urge to protect him from it either. A former colleague of his, someone I had known socially for years, and who reached out to me afterward, more out of habit than any real closeness, described the termination meeting to me in more detail than I probably needed. David, sitting across from 2 executives and a lawyer, presented with printed expense reports he had no real way to explain, asked to resign quietly, rather than face a more formal investigation that might have followed him into any future job search. He was let go from the position he had spent over a decade building, losing, within the span of a single season, both the marriage and the career that had structured nearly every year of our life together. I remember hearing the news secondhand, through a mutual acquaintance, and feeling something far quieter than the satisfaction I might have expected. Mostly I felt tired, The way you feel after finally setting down something heavy you have been carrying for far longer than you realized. Grace and I had a conversation that same summer that I still think about often. She had pieced together most of the truth on her own by then, the way children of any age eventually do, and she came to me one evening asking, plainly, for the full story rather than the softened version I had instinctively started to offer her. I remember pausing before I answered, thinking of my own mother, of the quiet endurance she had modeled for me my entire childhood, and deciding, deliberately, to give my daughter something different. I told her everything, without minimizing any of it, without protecting David's image at the expense of my own honesty. She asked me, at one point, whether I regretted staying as long as I did without knowing, and I told her honestly that I did not think of those years as wasted, even now, because I had genuinely believed, for most of them, that what I had was real. She asked whether I thought her father had ever truly loved either of us, and I told her the truth, as best I understood it myself, that I believed he loved us in whatever limited way he was capable of loving anyone fully, and that the tragedy of it was not the absence of love, but the absence of the courage required to be honest about everything standing alongside it. Grace asked me, near the end of that conversation, how I had managed to stay so composed through the entire dinner with Lauren, and I told her honestly that composure had never been about staying calm for its own sake. It had been the only tool I had that let me gather the truth before it could be taken away from me again by another convincing explanation. I told her that sometimes the strongest thing a person can do is not the loudest reaction available to them, but the most patient one, the one that lets you see clearly enough to actually decide what happens next, rather than reacting so quickly that the truth slips past you again. I told her that love does not excuse deception, that strength is not the same thing as silence, and that a woman is always allowed to choose clarity over comfort, no matter how long she has already lived without it. There were harder months than I have described so far, stretches during the following winter when the finality of everything settled in more heavily than it had during the actual proceedings, evenings alone in the new apartment when the quiet felt less like peace and more like absence. I want to be honest about that, because I think stories like this one sometimes skip too quickly from confrontation to resolution, as though clarity alone erases grief. It does not. I grieved that marriage for longer than I expected to, even while remaining completely certain I had made the right decision, because grief and certainty, I learned, are entirely capable of existing in the same season of a person's life, without canceling each other out. Grace returned to school that fall carrying the whole truth with her for the first time, rather than the version of our family she had grown up believing was the complete picture. She called me more often that semester than she had in the 2 years before it, small check-in calls that had less to do with logistics and more to do with simply wanting to hear my voice. And I understood, without either of us saying it directly, that something had shifted permanently in how she saw both of her parents, and in how closely she now paid attention to the quieter warning signs in her own relationships going forward. She mentioned to me once, during one of those calls, that she found herself paying closer attention now to small inconsistencies in her own friendships and relationships, not out of suspicion exactly, but out of a new understanding that clarity is something worth actively pursuing rather than passively hoping for. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house once a marriage like that has finally, fully ended. Not the tense quiet of unresolved suspicion, but something steadier, something closer to peace, even when peace arrives wrapped in grief. I sold the house eventually, moved into something smaller with Grace during her remaining summers home from school, and slowly built a version of my life that belonged entirely to me, for the first time since I was 24 years old. I still run my small catering business, though it has grown since then in ways I never expected, word spreading quietly through the same community that once knew me only as David's wife. I still see Teresa every week, and Renee, in an unexpected turn of friendship, has become someone I speak with regularly, long after her professional work for me was finished. We meet for coffee most months now, and she has told me, more than once, that my case remains one of the more thoroughly documented ones she has worked on in years. A strange kind of compliment that I have come to appreciate more than I expected to when she first said it. I have not spoken to David beyond what our lawyers require, and I have found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I do not particularly miss the version of conversation we used to have, the kind built on things I did not yet know I did not know. I ran into him once, almost a year later, at a grocery store 2 towns over, neither of us expecting to see the other. He looked smaller somehow, older, worn down in a way that had nothing to do with age. We exchanged a brief civil greeting, asked after each other's basic well-being, the way strangers who once shared an entire life sometimes learn to do, and parted without either of us suggesting we speak further. I drove home that afternoon expecting to feel something larger than I did. Mostly, I felt a quiet, settled sense that whatever chapter he represented in my life had closed cleanly, without the lingering ache I had once assumed something like that would always carry. I heard, secondhand, sometime after that encounter, that David had moved into a small apartment across town, and was, according to a mutual acquaintance, mostly keeping to himself. I did not feel triumphant hearing that, the way some part of me once assumed I might. I mostly felt a quiet sadness for the version of him that had once taught our daughter to fish off a dock, a person who had genuinely existed alongside the person capable of everything else I eventually discovered, both of them true at once, in a way I am still learning to hold without needing to resolve the contradiction entirely. I think often about that morning his phone first lit up on the bathroom counter, about the 4 words I typed back to a woman I had never met, and about the plate I set before either of them understood what that evening was actually going to become. I did not invite Lauren to dinner to catch him. I understand that more clearly now than I did even in the weeks immediately afterward. I invited her because some part of me needed to see, with my own eyes, exactly what my life had quietly become, before I could allow myself to decide what it was no longer going to be. It took a second phone in a golf bag, an accountant's careful timeline, and a coffee shop conversation with a woman I once had every reason to resent, but eventually, I saw the whole picture clearly enough to finally walk away from it entirely. I wonder, honestly, whether you would have done what I did that morning, whether you would have set that 3rd plate, calm and deliberate, or whether you would have confronted him the moment the water shut off, before he even had a chance to dry off and pretend nothing had changed. I wonder, too, which twist surprised you more, the second phone hidden in that golf bag, or the unexpected alliance that formed afterward between 2 women who had every reason in the world to hate each other, and somehow did not. People sometimes ask me, when I tell this story now, whether I would do anything differently if I could go back to that morning with everything I know today. I have thought about that question more than almost any other, And the honest answer is that I would still set the third plate. Not because it was painless, and not because it resolved everything neatly the way a story sometimes promises to, but because it was the first moment in a long time where I acted from clarity rather than fear, where I chose to see something fully rather than continue managing my way carefully around the edges of it. I think that choice, more than any single piece of evidence Renee or Teresa ever helped me uncover, is what actually changed the direction of my life. I do not know if I would recommend the exact same approach to every woman facing something similar, because every marriage, every set of circumstances, carries its own particular shape, but I do believe, without hesitation, that whatever path you choose, clarity is always worth pursuing, even when the truth it eventually delivers is far harder to sit with than the comfortable uncertainty that came before it. I have told this story now more times than I once thought I would ever be willing to tell it. First to Teresa, then to Marcus, then eventually to Grace in full. And each time I tell it, I notice something slightly different about my own choices that morning. I notice, more than anything, how much of what I did came not from anger, but from a kind of clarity I did not know I was capable of until the moment I needed it most. I did not set that third plate because I wanted revenge. I set it because some steady, unshakable part of me understood that the only way through this was directly through it, eyes open, rather than around it, eyes closed the way I had allowed myself to keep them for months before that morning. I want to say something directly to anyone watching this who recognizes even a small piece of their own life in what I have described tonight. A receipt you have explained away, a scarf you decided not to ask about, a pattern of late nights you have told yourself means nothing. I am not going to tell you what to do with that recognition, because only you can weigh what you have actually seen against what you are choosing to believe. What I will tell you is that clarity, once you finally allow yourself to look for it honestly, tends to arrive whole, all at once, rather than in pieces you can manage one at a time indefinitely. However long it takes you to get there, I believe you deserve to see your own life as clearly as I eventually learned to see mine. I think about Kimberly sometimes too, a woman I never met and likely never will, whose own version of this story I can only imagine, learning secondhand, the way I eventually learned about Lauren, that the man she believed was building a future with her had been building parallel futures with at least one other woman at the very same time. There is no clean way to end a story like this one. No single villain whose punishment resolves everything neatly. Only a series of people, myself included, slowly learning to see clearly what had been hidden from us, each in our own time, each in our own way. I think about Teresa often, about how differently this story might have unfolded without a friend willing to sit with me at that kitchen table for hours, cross-referencing dates without ever once telling me I was overreacting. I think about Renee too, a woman who spends her professional life helping strangers see clearly what they had been avoiding, and about how strange it is that a stranger's careful, methodical kindness became one of the most important forces in changing the entire direction of my life. I have wondered, more than once, what would have happened if I had simply woken David the moment that text arrived, if I had confronted him immediately instead of quietly building an entire case first. I do not think that version of the story would have ended any differently in the long run, given everything Kimberly's messages eventually revealed. But I think it would have taken me considerably longer to understand the full shape of what I was actually dealing with, and I am not sure I would have arrived at the same clarity, or the same peace, moving through it that quickly. I think, too, about how differently this story might read if I had chosen anger as my primary response instead of patience. How much easier it might have been, in the moment, to simply raise my voice, to demand answers immediately, and how much I would have lost in doing so, both in terms of the evidence I eventually gathered, and in terms of my own sense of having handled an impossible situation with whatever grace I could manage. Tell me honestly, in the comments below, what you would have done differently that morning. Would you have set that third plate the way I did, calm and deliberate? Or would you have woken him the moment her text lit up the screen and confronted him before he even had the chance to dry off? Would you have wanted to know everything all at once, the way I eventually chose to find out? Or would you have preferred to discover it slowly, in smaller pieces, even if that meant living inside the uncertainty longer? And of everything I have shared with you today, which turn surprised you the most? Was it the yellow guest towels, the second phone hidden in that golf bag, or the unexpected alliance that formed afterward between two women who had every reason in the world to resent each other and somehow did not? If this story stayed with you the way it has stayed with me, there is another one waiting for you. One about a woman who discovered that her husband's business partner had been the far bigger betrayal all along, closer to home than she ever imagined possible, hiding in plain sight inside the very company they had built together. I think you will find, watching that story, that some of the same lessons apply, that clarity, however painful to reach, is almost always worth the discomfort of pursuing it fully, rather than settling for the comfortable half-answers that keep us stuck in place for far longer than we ever intend to be. Subscribe now so you never miss it, and if you found your way to this story today, know that you are not alone in whatever brought you here. There is always a way through to the other side of a life like this one, even when it does not feel that way in the middle of it. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next story.